Got the moanin cat blues, man. Is that a thing?
The moanin cat blues.
That sounds like
That's
it's
the
a
truth.
thing. Yeah.
That sounds like it's a thing. Yeah, I got the moanin cat blues. Tom Waits.
Yeah, it does.
Sounds like a song Tom Waits would sing.
It does, man. The moanin cat blues. Oh, that was my favorite album. Of course.
In the morning with the moanin cat blues. Oh man.
Oh, been a while since I sang the moanin cat blues, man.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. So yeah, we are recording. We have this new setup. I actually kind of got Logic going on my MacBook, and now we're rocking and rolling.
Yeah,
right?
This is pretty great. So we're gonna have better fidelity than we had last time, which I'm glad. You know, always worried about that pro audio. You know, we want to make sure
pro audio.
Yeah,
and that's when we started doing the lunchtime episodes. Chris and I kind of had a not a back and forth, but he was like, "Man, the lunchtime episodes, like, there's just something." I'm like, I love them. The lunchtime episodes are so fun. And Chris just goes, "Yeah, but the audio sucks."
Yeah, I mean,
you were just like, "But the audio's terrible, Marty." And I'm just like not caring about that.
Yeah, you're like who cares?
It's raw, it's punk rock, it's cinema verite.
Yeah,
whatever,
I know. Yeah. I mean, I like the punk aspect of it and everything. You know, I'm not. It's not so much like that, but I just always think like, oh well, some episodes, somebody's first episode, and they're like, oh, what's this album of the year? And they listen to it.
Yeah,
and it's you and
it's
me.
Like iPhone recording,
burping in an iPhone in the middle of with like the worst kind of.
The first few of them we do a good job of explaining, and you do really. You're just like, hey, here's the deal. You know, this is recorded on our iPhones while we're eating lunch at a Mediterranean buffet.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever. So,
man, what I wouldn't give to just be able to do that again, though. So honestly,
shit.
Man, you know,
my God.
I'll take the pro audio all day, man. Just to, you know.
Yeah, no, I'm with you 100%, man.
Man, been missing it, but I'm glad that we're rolling again, because it just feels like we've been kind of talking about the next episode for a while and all this, and I know we got a couple out. Before now, but I feel like we're really.
But this is kind of we're back in the year format, so we're kind of doing that again. So I guess that is something we should probably say. We are back in the year format, guys, and this is something that hopefully will continue from here on out. Now that we have a better recording situation with technology the way it is. And what year are we doing this? We're doing this episode.
1980.
1980.
So, hadn't been to the 80s in a while, deliberately, because we kind of overcovered the 80s for a little bit at the top.
We did. And then, what was the last 80s year we did?
It was 84, I think, about a year ago.
Yeah.
So I think that was the last
replacements
time.
Replacements?
Replacements. With Steph and the Bengals. And
that's right. Yeah.
Is that right? 84?
Yeah, that's fun.
Or was that 80? Good. Yeah, I think it was 84. Yeah.
85 was Tom Waits, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, Rain Dogs.
So, and then
we did 88.
I don't remember what the other album was. Yeah.
So we've done a couple of things in the 80s, but going back to the very first year of the 80s, 1980, and I think we've had some exciting choices for sure, man. So we'll get into those in a second, but we've kind of changed things up as far as up at the top of the call, at the top of the episode.
Top of the episode?
Yeah, in the first episode. We used to do the year in review and everything like that, and we just didn't feel like we were getting the bang for our buck out of that. If you guys remember, we kind of talked about this last time we did one of these episodes, and what we really would like to start doing is talking more about, things from the year that are important, maybe a couple of highlights or lowlights. In 1980s, we got really terrible news in 1980, but then talk a little bit more about just trends in music, and I think that's a little more interesting, to say, well, what's kind of going on in 1980 or thereabouts that's interesting that is going to affect music going forward. And I think we've got plenty of topics that we can.
Totally. So one, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but one thing that you notice, I've brought up this kind of idea of tectonic plates shifting, and 1980 there may not be a better example of that. Like, you have punk, you have electronica, you have new wave, you have all of this stuff just going on. Springsteen, The River comes out in 1980, so it's pretty crazy. The things that, like, the tone that this year is kind of setting for the future, I feel like. I don't know if that's something that you've thought about at all, but
no, I do feel like 1980 starts to mark. I mean, it sometimes decades blend together, and sometimes they start to break pretty quickly. And I feel like 1980, while it still feels like it's the capstone of the 70s, Disco Sucks is already starting. Like there's already people who are saying, whatever the 70s were about, we're over it. Like, let's do something new and different.
Right.
And you can already sense that that's changing. Punk has already been around for a few years, but it's very clear that the 80s, in some ways, belongs to a back to basics approach. Now, that's pretty ironic because in the end, the 80s are the most like overblown decade. But but at least, it starts with a different view of what overblown is going to be, compared to what Led Zeppelin was doing in the 70s.
Right.
Gone are the 10-minute songs, with Roman numerals on a side. I mean, it's not completely gone, but that kind of big prog rock, funk freak out, free jazz moment is really kind of gets back to basics at the beginning of the 80s. And it's clear that the dominant form of music, I think, in the 80s is the pop song. I think more than any other, almost more than any other decade since the 50s, probably. It's the pop song.
Really? You think that?
I think so. I think the 80s are more, because when I think of the 80s, I don't think of like Owner of a Lonely Heart first. I think first of like Thriller. Well, I guess that's a little bit longer, but I think of like Michael Jackson, Madonna, Prince, a lot of songs that are real.
That makes sense.
Like, their songs first, their pop songs first, and the artistry is within that pop format. In the 60s, it starts that way for sure, but it starts to break open and get progressive and crazy with the Beatles. And in the 70s, it goes really crazy, to where you had album-oriented rock and everything like that.
Yeah.
And in the 80s, punk, one of the influences of punk is that things start to go back to simple, verse, chorus, verse, song structures again.
Right.
And for better or worse, but that's the structure becomes a lot less interesting in the 80s. But the sort of pop song as a format becomes more interesting, I think.
Yeah.
In the 80s, I think it's one of the big hallmarks of the decade.
Sure.
Because you have people who to this day, they won't get away from 80s songs. You know what I mean? Like they just listen to the Duran Duran records till they die.
Van Halen and like all that.
Well, there's that too. Yeah. I mean, rock is really not that great. Mainstream rock is not that great in the 80s. That's one of the failures of the decade. But
well, I think there's some exceptions that can be made, but maybe by and large, it wasn't the greatest thing ever. So
there's a lot of great rock in the. But most of it is coming from like the college radio charts. You know what I mean?
That's true.
It's stuff that's going overground from
like Britain to.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff out of the UK in the 80s. I like Duran Duran. I was just making fun of them, but I love Duran Duran, and U2 and
I do too.
REM and all those bands and stuff. But that wasn't what was burning up the rock charts was like Def Leppard and that.
Later in the 80s, I feel like maybe in the early 80s, I don't think that stuff had come to fruition yet.
Yeah. Well, not the hairband stuff, really. But, Van Halen
85,
was
86, 87. Yeah, that's true. Van Halen was around. But 85, 86, 87, I feel like was the kind of salad days, or that's when it began. That's
to me, 87 is the hallmark, the high water mark for hair bands,
if you can consider it
the high or low water mark.
I was listening to the Neil Peart episode the other day,
Dolph.
where me and Dolph kind of squared off about hair bands. Like somebody somewhere liked it. I'm just saying.
Yeah. He's
whatever. But
Dolph is really. I think I figured it out. I think I used the word butt rock a lot back then.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because butt rock now has come to mean like that Nickelback era kind of stuff. Like a lot of people say butt rock, and that's what they mean. But like we were using the word
Godsmack and all that stuff. Yeah.
But we were using the term butt rock, and the first time I heard that term used was I think Chris Cornell using it, talking about. Like,
really?
Yeah, cock rockers in the 80s. You know what I mean? Like, it was just a nice way to say cock rock. I'm sorry to say, guys. That's a pretty crude word. But, and so butt rock, so we called it all butt rock, And I think back then I used to sort of say, well, Rush was kind of butt rock, And that's probably, that's not fair.
Okay.
That's not really fair. But after listening to the episode when Dolph was getting onto me for calling them a hair band, I never called Rush a hair band, but I think I may have called them a butt rock band, and that he didn't really like that.
Fair enough. No, I get it.
But yeah, they're around in the 80s and stuff. And there's still like the big like prog rock bands and stuff, but a lot of those are selling out like crazy in the 80s.
That's
you know
true.
What I mean? Like
That's true. Yeah.
Try to find ways to chase hits,
Yeah. And well, and it's also kind of a thing where it's like they were almost made to sell out, like selling out, that was kind of like that's what they were in it for. They were in it to make this overproduced kind of sloppy madness, and they were in it to go on world tours and sell out arenas and shit. So
impress women,
no, I don't know.
And the thing,
excuse me, sorry. What did you say?
Well, no, I think it's a funny argument. It's like, can you sell out if you're, if all you want, if you're in Poison?
If you want to sell out,
that's all you wanted
is that
to do in
selling
the first
out?
place. Is it really selling out? And, I mean, the answer is no. It's not selling out. It's just garbage music. It's like if the music is any good, then we'll go okay, fine. I mean, Guns N' Roses is a great example. Like to me, there's not a huge difference between Guns N' Roses and Poison. People would freak out to hear me say that, but I think the difference is Guns N' Roses at their best are really damn good.
Yeah,
whereas
exactly.
Poison at their best are still really, really bad. And so I mean, at the end of the day, they were both in it probably for the same things, but one was pretty good and one wasn't. And that's the difference.
One of them had an approach that was more raw and punk rock, and the other one had an approach that was more, I don't even know.
Yeah, just Sunset Strip, whatever.
Just have you seen Vince Neil nowadays?
No, I haven't. Is he?
Please don't Google his name. Do not
Does
do a
he look
Google
bad?
Image search for. Yeah, he's fat and stuff. Forgive me, guys. I'm not trying to body shame anyone or anything like that.
I don't know. The guy who's saying girls, and objectified women and all that stuff on those years. You can make fun of that guy for being fat.
I don't think we're gonna get hashtag canceled for making fun of this. I hope not. Anyway,
that was the worst thing about the '80s, man. The outright sexism of the '80s. And there's always sex, and probably institutionally much worse, even going farther back. But from a musical standpoint, it really went overground by by the end of the decade. It's like women on MTV were halfway; they were just there to wiggle their butts in the Hot for Teacher video or something. And that was something like when I was growing up as a kid, I thought I didn't like rock music because that's all rock music was.
That's what you thought it was. Yeah, exactly.
Like it was just like, oh, it's just music for strip clubs or something. Like I'm not interested in that, And and then later I was like, oh, Nirvana. It's like, oh, that's something different, And that's what, like in the 80s versus 90s debates, I'm a 90s kid for sure.
Sure.
Even though there's a lot of music I love in the 80s, but sometimes I sound really cynical about the 80s. But it's really because the stuff I love about the 80s is the stuff that heavily influenced the music of the 90s. So, the Pixies and REM and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, well, they're 80s bands, yes, but... the values of the culture really weren't that. Like it took a decade for that to really become like the mainstream.
Yeah.
So, but you can't take it away from the 80s. There's a lot of really exciting stuff going on. And what we wanted to talk about really was the influence of the synthesizer in the 80s. That was kind of our big thing to talk about. Because 1980, it really starts to feel like, obviously there's been a lot of synthesizers, and we talked about modular synths and like Keith Emerson and guys like that, and Stevie Wonder, they played synthesizers.
Yeah, sure.
Before
absolutely.
this. But it feels like once the 80s kind of kick in pretty quickly, there's a decision made somewhere that the synthesizer is super interesting right now. Let's do interesting stuff with it.
Let's just ride this wave, man.
Yeah. And we watched a great documentary, Synth Britannia. I don't know if you've seen it recently, but it's so good. Yeah. And I definitely recommend it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's excellent.
And part of it is just that the cost of synthesizers came down around this time, late 70s, early 80s. Right. So suddenly hobbyists could get a hold of it. You didn't have to
It was attainable. It was accessible. It's something you could do if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I love that early synth music, man. I think it's crazy. Too. Like it's crazy. You can hear just the raw experimentation of it, the fun people are having with it. Like you can have stuff that's really like crazy sounding like the normal Warm Leatherette or something where it just sounds like this gross, raw, weird pre-industrial music kind of sound. And then you have something like early Depeche Mode, which is all poppy and fun.
Yeah,
and it's just
like can't get enough. Yeah,
like that's great. Like, and I love all of it. I think it's really
Well, and you were talking about how a lot of '80s bands influenced '90s bands. I mean, it was a little before 1980, but Kraftwerk was responsible for influencing a lot of hip hop.
Oh, right.
I mean, if it wasn't for Kraftwerk, there would be no Africa Bambaataa. Like, there just wouldn't be. Yeah. I mean, there would be something like it. I mean, he would have done something, but it wouldn't have been.
It wouldn't have sounded like it did, right?
It wouldn't have sounded like it did. Wouldn't have been as cool. I don't know. So,
Yeah, it's so wild that a bunch of really uptight looking dudes who look like accountants, from Germany, like singing about their pocket calculators, ends up being like this hugely influential band in hip hop, But it's true.
Yeah.
It's
there was a guy. I'm trying to think of his name. Braun, the company that made like appliances and like electric shavers and shit.
Sure.
The guy that was, I think his name is Dieter Rams. He was the original, one of the head designers at Braun in like the 70s and 80s, and like he was really known for this like super minimalistic design. People call Braun like the prototypical Apple because of his influence and stuff, and like
interesting
that kind of design. His frame of minimalist design influenced, like you can see it in like the iPod and the iPhone, all that stuff. So it's kind of interesting. I almost bought, there was a book of his designs that was at this art museum in Houston that we were at about a month ago. I almost bought it. I'm like, this is cool, man. But,
yeah, I feel like a lot of that minimalism and stuff influenced the sort of sound of music around that period too. You know what I mean? Like,
absolutely.
Hold a chord on a synthesizer, and that's interesting.
Exactly. Yeah, bitchin' Bajas, right?
Yeah, but
and, in some ways,
I think that's more interesting in 1977 than it is in 2019 or whatever.
2019, 2020, opening for stereo land.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that in some ways, because that Synth Britannia documentary talks a lot about how synth stuff came to the foreground, and the synth guys really liked the energy of punk, but they didn't really identify it, and like it was this thing where it was kind of like a reaction to that almost.
I always felt like it was an evolution of that. Like
really?
New Wave, if there's a distinction between New Wave and punk, and I mean, that's a whole other thing, like whether New Wave was kind of a marketing term for punk. Like, if you're, I think Joe Strummer tells a fantastic story in West Way to the World about how, what they did was punk. I mean, they always thought of it as punk. And then he saw something probably in some, trade mag variety or something, and it had Bugs Bunny and a leather jacket.
Yeah, that's right. You were like, let's listen to some New Wave kids or some shit.
Yeah, it's like, don't call it punk, call it New Wave.
New Wave.
And he was like, what the hell? Like, what does Bugs Bunny have to do with anything we've been about, But I think so I think one thing that people sometimes are surprised to hear is like how kind of sketchy New Wave as a term is, because it was a kind of co-opt of punk. But I think what history also proves, though, if you play it out, is that New Wave is its own thing, but it's kind of punk values with synthetic instrumentation included somehow. And I think if you look at stuff at like New Order's like one of the best examples of this. You've got a band that goes from being Joy Division, which is a straight up punk band, and kind of really dark.
Maybe the first emo band, even.
Kind of.
Make an argument for that.
You can make an argument, like definitely super, dark and gothic and all this stuff, and kind of the beginning of a lot of different subgenres of punk. And then the band, after Ian passes away, the band evolves to be a more synthetic band, and that's New Wave. And to me, they're like the distinction, the fulcrum is that difference between Joy Division and New Order, is the difference between punk and New Wave, I think.
That's interesting.
I kind of think.
I guess I never really thought about it that way, but that's true. And I always knew the story behind Joy Division and New Order and kind of Ian Curtis's death and how they kind of came to be, but I never really put two and two together, I guess, like you did. But it makes a lot of sense.
But I think that shows that it's more of an evolution and not just not like necessarily a backlash against punk. Because I think if it was a backlash against punk, it would probably be proggier, a lot of that early synth stuff, But you listen to like OMD and stuff like that, while they're definitely interested in like sonic timbres with synths and the way things sound, they're not super fussy about like playing really fast or doing like you know what I mean. They're not coming out of like what you would expect a sort of counter. I don't know, a counter movement towards punk would be a lot more technical, you would think, or something. It seems like they sort of adopt those values, but then apply them to electronics. And that's one of the cool things about punk, really, is that it ends up being a way, and we're going to get to that, whoa boy, with our selections. We got a lot to talk about punk. But
we sure do, man. Wow.
But it's the thing I always love the most about punk, is that punk is not just a sound, it's a set of values.
Yeah.
And those set of values of, do it yourself, anyone can do it, get out there and make the music you want. Don't let anyone else get in your way. Like, I think the New Wave guys and the synth guys adopted that to their bones. And I think in that sense, it was always kind of punk,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that Gary Newman in that Synth Britannia documentary, there's a scene where he's being interviewed or he's talking about his experience with the music he's made in that whole scene, and he said something along the lines of, punk was very idealistic and punk wanted to change the world, and it was very they had all these lofty idealistic goals of kind of making the world better, and like while that was great and all, it's just wasn't really into that. That wasn't really my thing. Like, I know that sounds selfish, but at the end of the day, like, I just wanted to make music, and I didn't really I wasn't trying to think about how it affected the world in a greater way. And he was like, nothing against the Clash or anything like that, but that's just kind of the way it was just two different approaches kind of, but yes, like you said, a similar set of values.
I think, I mean, you may have something to that because on the one hand, like, let's take Depeche Mode. They're a great example of like a synthetic band that came to being. 1980 is a little early. I think their first album's like 81 or something. But we're just talking about this kind of era, right? Like Depeche Mode is not a punk band in any sense, right? I mean, they're closer to like a boy band in the early days than they are to a punk band.
Yeah.
But they've got very stripped down and bare like arrangements on that first album, and like you said, Just Can't Get Enough, and all that kind of stuff is like it sort of has some of the musical values of punk. But you're right; it doesn't really have all of the social values of punk, and maybe that does start to break down because, like, Heaven 17 and bands like that, there were bands that came out that had almost like and they kind of walked the line between like an 80s preppy yuppie kind of thing and an ironic take on the 80s preppy yuppie thing, and you're like, well, I don't know which one it is actually, to be honest with you. Like, maybe they are or maybe they aren't, like it's even Depeche Mode in the early days kind of feels a little bit like that, and it's like, well, that's not, you can't really imagine Johnny Rotten falling into that, Public Image Limited is not that, you know what I mean? It's like, so there's a lot of ways to play a synthesizer in the 80s. I guess that's what we decided.
Right. No, yeah, totally.
What are some of your favorite like synth bands from that era? From the early 80s?
Good question. Yaz. I really like Yaz. Oh,
God, I love
Yaz is the guy from, sorry about that. One of the guys from early Depeche Mode who left the band. Clark. Yaz is his thing.
And then he goes on and does Erasure, which is also amazing.
That's him too?
Yeah, that's also him. This guy is like a wrestler. He's like one of the few guys you can think of who's like who started 3 major bands, hugely influential bands, and was like the driving force to 3 of them. And not like, I'm Eric Clapton and I went and played in Blind Faith or something. You know what I mean? Like Eric Clapton, it's whatever he's doing is going to have people look at it. It's like this guy just did it on quality of his writing,
Yeah, no, totally.
Yeah, Yaz is great. Upstairs at Eric's is one of my favorite.
Upstairs at Eric's is awesome. Yeah, for sure.
I love that. That's what's the song "Losing My Touch," where LCD Sound System was like, they're going to make something real, going to make a Yaz record.
Yes, yeah. Losing My Edge, right?
Losing My Edge. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, of course. That's it.
The track. Yeah. That's. Yeah,
Losing
he
My
references
Touch
like
Rolling Stones.
Literally like 7,000 different like bands and subgenres in that song, and that's kind of why I love it.
Me too. I think it's so. It's like the ultimate like hipster. Like love letter to being an asshole hipster, kind of, like it's sort of a love letter and it's sort of tongue in cheek at the same time. It's perfect.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So as far as other bands that I dig from that era, OMD is kind of cool. Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark. That's the coolest fucking band name ever. Is. Like
they're really good too. Like man, like Enola Gay and Architecture and Morality in that album. Like I go back and I listen to those and I still, while they definitely people say they sound dated. It sounds very 80s, but what the hell? The music of the early 60s sounds like the 60s.
Exactly.
It's okay,
like Jefferson Airplane doesn't sound like it was made in 1997, and that's all right.
It's okay for it to sound dated if it's still good. Now, sometimes when people say it sounds dated in the 80s, it means it sounds thin and terrible or whatever. But not everything's good. But OMD still holds up, I think.
Agreed. Cabaret Voltaire, they're another band from that era, right?
Yeah, they're pretty cool. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of these bands, I guess if you can call them bands, I don't even know, acts, whatever, they had these kind of larger than life names, but that wasn't really, it was almost like, Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, Cabaret Voltaire, New Order, like all these names that were like references from things in the past, but kind of mysterious and, that kind of thing, which is
very European kind of
thing. It is,
too,
it is. And like, a lot of it, Synth Britannia, a lot of it came from the UK. Really, So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, no, it's harder to find like great new wave bands just from the U.S. Actually, even just stopping to think about it, it's like, well, Devo if they count, but like they're kind of genre benders. But,
on the outside, a little bit.
But like really, off the top of my head, I'm like, oh geez, did we even contribute anything to new wave?
Right, exactly.
We had a lot of like great punk bands still going on, and you don't have to mess with that, you got Minutemen and all that kind of stuff, Bad Brains, but real new wave bands.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe the synthesizer thing wasn't as big of a deal in the States as it was in Britain for some reason. Like
there was a backlash against it big time. Like my parents hated anything with the synthesizer.
Really?
Even though like pop music, that's the other thing. The synth was embraced by pop, just pure pop music, and there's a lot of that, but it's not really new wave. It's more Madonna or something, like dance music.
Like that stuff. Thriller was written on a mini Moog. That's all mini Moog. For sure.
Yeah, I mean, since all over 1999 and stuff like that. And it's all
here's maybe the approximation you can make in that regard is in America, synthesizers were something that producers and session cats used. In the UK, people said, oh, we can make a band. They looked at a synthesizer and they said, we can make a band out of this.
Yeah.
Because remember the one guy, I don't know who it was in the Synth Britannia documentary, who was like, well, people just used to say, they used to come up to the synthesizer and just say, what button do I press to make a hit record?
Yeah.
That's
the dude from O&D.
So I think that I think you're right. Yeah, and so maybe there was some of that. It was like, well, man, we found this magical like skeleton key that could get us, on top of the pops. Like, let's try and figure this thing out and crack this code and see how to use it. Where in America, everybody wanted, like. All the high school kids wanted to be, Kiss and Led Zeppelin and The Who and all that.
Eddie Van Halen,
so, Eddie Van Halen, yeah, exactly. I mean, like you watch Dazed and Confused, like any of the bands that were featured, and nobody there were no synthesizers in the band Foghat. Chris.
Yeah,
that was not a thing, So
I mean, it's that arena rock stuff like hung on here in the U.S. and the U.S. just tends to be a little bit more conservative when it comes to music anyway, and some of it is just that music. The U.S. is so big compared to the UK as a market, and the UK was heavily influenced by the music mags, the weekly music mags. So like the NME or Melody Maker, they could make or break a band in a week. They could just say, hey, and there was a big enough market for it that if they said, hey guys, there's this new band, they're called Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark or whatever, check them out. Well, then next gig that they play in London is going to be huge because they were just covered in this mag. There was nothing like that in the U.S. until MTV came along.
Yeah.
And then MTV was quickly kind of colonized by dinosaur rock acts too, So, there were definitely bands that made it, but I mean, really in the early days of MTV, a lot of the big bands of the time were holdouts. They didn't want to make music videos, and so.
Well, there's something interesting that I'm going to touch on in the second part of our conversation about MTV. So I'm glad you brought that up. But
let's table that.
What I'm going to say, what I was going to say to that, I'm going to have to table until part 2 of this discussion.
You got it.
So.
Yeah, it's. But that's a real interesting thing to think about how new wave bands like the Police, for instance, broke and it kind of got bigger in the U.S. because they were making videos when bands like Yes weren't,
Right.
And so the bands that America maybe was more likely to embrace were kind of overshadowed by whatever was going down on MTV. So, but yeah, I think I think the early '80s are interesting because there's a little bit of that backwash of the '70s still, but and especially a lot of bands are kind of coming to grips with the back to basics approach of punk, and it all turns into like a flowering of pop music. And I think up until about '85, there's a lot of really interesting stuff that happens, really strange music that happens, and then it all gets super gentrified by the middle of the decade. And I think the latter half of the '80s are really terrible. Like college radio is amazing in the latter half.
That's
of the 80s.
true. Yeah,
but I think when
everything on the foreground was just ass. You're right.
Yeah, I mean the mainstream
rock
rock is awful in the late '80s. Your mainstream pop is pretty lousy in the late '80s. I mean, there's some highlights, but I mean it's pretty lousy.
Are you gonna say Debbie Gibson and Tiffany were lousy? I mean, that's Chris?
Yes. I'm gonna say that. I'm sorry. I'm gonna go out on a. I hope if you've listened to enough of our episodes right now, you will not be shocked to learn that I don't think Debbie Gibson and Tiffany really brought the goods.
So whenever the coronavirus hit and everybody was quarantining and the musicians were like at home in their home studios posting on YouTube and doing these tributes or whatever, I came across Billy Joe Armstrong from Green Day doing I Think We're Alone Now.
Really?
And I love that song. It's pretty fucking good.
Yeah. Well, the song's great, but that's not a Tiffany song. That's a.
It's not. Is it?
Yeah. Who is it? Tommy James and the Shondells. From the 60s.
You're right. You're right. She did cover that, didn't she? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, she was terrible. I mean, whatever. She's a teenage singer, and you got to kind of give credit because she did, for a teen singer, she did it the old-fashioned way, which was like go to where teenagers are, malls, and perform songs for kids. Yeah. And she did covers of I Think We're Alone Now, and I Saw Her Standing There, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And it caught on organically, insofar as something like that can.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean it's good music because it's not.
Exactly. No, that's the truth, man.
Yeah, I mean, but here we're talking about the synthesizer. I mean, that's a great example. That's 86, 87 probably, right? Tiffany maybe kicking off by that. So by then, the synthesizer is not a radical instrument anymore. It's Tiffany. It's, the DX7 Tyne sound that I hate so much. I always complain about, right? It's like... and that is what's so kind of crazy is that it starts as this revolutionary instrument and turns into just another sound.
Yeah,
and then I think in dance music, it's still, I think electronic music is still interesting. Sometimes I think I come across as very anti-synthetic or anti-synthesizer here on the podcast, but I'm not really. I just don't think synth or electronic music is automatically interesting. I think you've got to do something with it. You can't just go, well, here, I crap something out of my digital workstation. What do you think? It's automatically legitimate because it's got bleeps and bloops in it, and it's like, no, that doesn't
press
really...
a button and make a hit record.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, and I have, even from my own experience, like taken loop packages and just thrown stuff together and had people who would never listen to my deeply felt like rock music, and they go, oh, that's interesting, and it's like, oh,
right.
Put it together in like 10 seconds,
Exactly.
There's no art in this,
Yeah, it's not really that hard to, pre-program some drum loops and make some kind of like beat, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean, it's still artistically valid when done well, And
yeah. Oh, of course it is. Yeah. No, I agree. I completely agree. I mean, I listen to a lot of electronic music, and that's the thing. And I mean, we've talked about this before on the podcast, and this is electronic music, then and now. Like, there's a big backlash with people that don't use real instruments and aren't playing guitars and aren't playing, keyboards or whatever, and there's kind of this attitude that somehow people that are using GarageBand and are using these computers to make music only, that somehow they're worse because of it. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think anyone that has interesting ideas can make interesting music with whatever tools they choose. And I mean, there's a lot of shitty guitar. I mean, we just talked about butt rock for 5 minutes, So, like, for every, Nickelback, there's a Flying Lotus, and for every Skrillex, there's Explosions in the Sky, or whatever, whatever you want to say, like, however you want to approximate it. But,
no, I agree with you. I think one of the things that I learned over time is that, a lot of those social constructs where, it's like, oh, even disco sucks, disco sucks is happening in the early 80s. It's a backlash against disco, and it's complicated because there's some socio-political stuff in there if you look at it,
Yeah,
but
for sure.
But even ignoring that, a lot of it was just tribalism. It's like, well, I like rock music. I only want to listen to this. I don't want to be challenged to listen to this disco stuff, and I hate the people who go to those disco dances, so to hell with them.
Yeah, like Disco's I don't do cocaine on Saturday nights.
I mean, in fairness, I don't... If it was backlash against Studio 54 or something, then fine. But, like, there's a lot of disco sounding stuff that's incredible. And
it's awesome. Yes, it's amazing.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be an all or nothing kind of thing, and it's the same thing with electronic music. You don't have to, like my parents said, "Oh, this is a damn synthesizer." The first time I ever heard of a synthesizer, I was a kid.
Yeah.
And, it was just my dad trash talking it. These guys and their stupid synthesizers. It's all robot music, and it's
Yeah, and I think there was some things with hip hop too, where like a lot of white people were like, "Well, this isn't. What are they're just like taking parts of songs and putting them?" And like, no, there's more to it than that. Trust me, like, that kind of thing. And I think there was a big kind of thing there. With hip hop as well.
Oh, that's a whole other thing. Because there's a couple of threads going. Racism is the big one, obviously.
Exactly.
Get too deep into that, but I think obviously there's a big part of it is white people wanting to listen to white artists or whatever. But I think some of it too was that sampling was new, and the notion that you're going to take a loop and make that into its own song. I think for a lot of people, you were in the era of big. It was big money in rock music, and so suddenly, if you're, let's say, Vanilla Ice, and you take a clip of Under Pressure, so here you have one of the two of the most beloved artists of all time, Queen and David Bowie, and then here's this guy, and people are like, well, he's irrelevant. And he's taking their bass lick that they created with their blood, sweat, and tears, and then he's just talking over it, and then that's a hit song, and he didn't even get permission. It's like a lot of people saw it as like a moral argument against sampling, and of course that's a weak argument, but people aren't thinking about it like that. They're defending David Bowie, or they're defending Queen in their mind because they love those guys.
Some like hard-nosed punk rock people even thought that MIA using The Clash and Paper Planes was bullshit.
Yeah.
Like, there were people that I knew that called bullshit on that song. I'm like, look, man, it's a great song. Sample was used really well in that song. I think Diplo made that beat, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong about that, but yeah, like, it's not bad, man. It's good. MIA's art stands on its own too. She's not like this, pop star. She is kind of a pop star, but she also has an artistic side. So,
and the sample contextually makes sense. Straight to Hell is one of the greatest songs the Clash ever recorded. So,
absolutely,
the audacity to sample that is pretty ballsy, but it's a song about people in the third world being left behind by the first world, and then Paper Planes is exactly about that exact same thing. So it's not like I think Joe Strummer would be like, hell yeah, use my song. What I mean?
He really liked electronic music too, so he would have been fine with it, I think.
Yeah. I think that's the kind of thing where we can all turn into conservatives real quick, lowercase c conservatives, where it's like, oh no, if it's not what I'm used to, then it's, it's bad, and I think you always have to kind of fight that.
Yeah, well, and it goes back to the thread Paul Westerberg, I think, that was, when we were talking about the Replacements, how, this punk scene is supposed to be so inviting, but at the end of the day, like, if you do something that they don't like, you're still going to piss them off. Like, it's kind of a microcosm of the world at large, like, don't deviate from, what we're comfortable with, or else fuck you,
Yeah.
So,
and that, punk was never supposed to be about like that kind of thing. It was supposed to be opening doors, not closing them.
Yeah.
And so it's even with myself, I always think of myself as kind of punk to my core, but you'll notice, it's like I don't act like a punk guy. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of times it'd be like, oh, you wouldn't even be able to tell, But
you're not a guy that has a mohawk and, Liberty spikes, and you don't wear a studded
I've got a
belt
job,
yeah, right, yeah. You're not living in a dumpster.
Yeah, exactly. But but all of those values at their core, they're still a huge part of my life. So I think that
absolutely.
I'll always kind of feel like I carry some of that punk with me.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
But I think that's true with listening to all kinds of music. And I will say that I think people are way more open-minded now about that kind of stuff than they used to be.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think
I agree.
the age of Spotify and Apple Music and stuff like that has really opened up a lot of people to that. Someone was, I was just having a debate with some friends, and I didn't actually get a chance to enter into it too much because I was prepping for this, but like they were literally just talking about 90s music, and they were kind of teared in my beer kind of thing where they were like, oh, music used to be so good. But they were like, has there been any good rock music in the last 10 years? And I think there's an argument to be made that there hasn't. Yeah. I mean, there obviously has been a lot of great rock music.
Yeah.
But it's not at the forefront of culture anymore, and I think everybody knows that.
Yeah.
Like we had a whole episode
we talked about it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Rock did.
You know, but I think that one thing is that a lot of that old rock music, like people are actually listening to it now because it's not expensive to buy into it. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So a lot of younger kids, it's not so much that they're into oldies, but they're just like, what? Queen? Oh, I saw that Bohemian Rhapsody movie. Oh, that's pretty good. Let's listen to that.
Yeah,
for
my
a
nephew,
month,
Jackson, who's a senior in high school, he watched the Bohemian. He saw that movie before I did, you know, and I
still haven't seen it.
Really, it's pretty good. Well, we talked about it. So,
yeah, I want to see it.
Yeah, it's not bad. It's worth seeing. But yeah, no, totally. Like that cachet still stands on its own, I think. And yeah, it's a pretty easy entry point when you can just get on Spotify and, you know, listen to News of the World or A Night at the Opera if you want. So,
right.
Yeah, totally.
Well, we kind of ran the gamut here, but I think there was some interesting stuff about kind of where the fulcrum was shifting in the early 80s.
Good conversation. I agree. I completely agree.
So let's get into it, man. I got to say, I love our choices for 1980. I think they have some similarities.
Sorry.
They have some real similarities and some real, like, marked differences. And I think it's kind of fun. It'll be fun to talk about them both. We're going to start, I guess, with mine, right?
Yeah, before we start, let me do something.
Okay.
Courtney got me a mini fridge for my birthday, dude. And it's right below my desk. And I have it's filled with Waterloo...
Waterloo. Oh, I've got a bunch of those downstairs. Now I'm thinking of one. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I was thinking about getting a mini fridge up here, but like you can't record. You can't have a refrigerator like whirring away here. You know.
This one's pretty quiet. Luckily, like you can't really hear it. So
yeah.
So that's good, and it's like on the floor and stuff. So it's not like that kind of thing. But
awesome.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry. You can continue. I apologize.
Okay. So, obviously, 1980, there's a lot of great albums that came out. I got to say, up front, neither of us picked, I think, the big dog from 1980, which is Remain in Light by the Talking Heads.
Talking Heads.
For a lot of people is the kind of the pinnacle of the Talking Heads, and it is an incredible album. We were both listening to it. We were kind of debating, and it was like, but I got to say, right now is like a prime time to be into the Talking Heads because the REM podcast that Adam Scott does and Scott Aukerman does, like they're doing a whole thing on Talking Heads right now.
Are they really?
Yeah, they are. And there was another podcast that just started about the Talking Heads. So like, I don't know what's in the air, but like Talking Heads, if you want to talk about Remain in Light or hear about Remain in Light, go find that podcast. Yeah. They'll clown around for about an hour, but they'll talk
one of these days we're going to find a way to get Adam Scott on this podcast.
I think he's too big for us, bro. But if you can figure it out, man,
it's gonna happen. I am hell bent, Adam. If you're listening, you have an open invitation to be on Album of the Year podcast to talk about anything you want, music wise, of course.
Yeah.
And like you can't no softball. You can't come in here and be like, I want to talk about Justin Bieber. No, none of that. It's got to be some nerdy shit. All right.
Yeah.
You want to get the Pokey Joes.
Yeah.
We got to talk about fucking something cool.
Yeah. The Pokey Joes doesn't come if you're trying to get us to talk about
you can cut that out.
Robbie Williams or something.
I could probably talk about Robbie Williams, but
I could too. Yeah, but that wouldn't be half as fun as talking about Kraftwerk or something. So
that's true.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So Remain in Light is definitely a phenomenal album, and I did debate whether I would pick that one or not, but I ended up going with what is honestly my favorite album of 1980. Sometimes you have to just do a gut check on this and be like, well, what's the album that I really listen to the most or that's influenced me the most or I love the most? And this is what I picked. Roaring drums.
Mm-hmm. So good, man.
There's her voice.
Oh yeah.
And this is the weight.
Still holds us. It's still pristine too.
Oh,
I don't know how. She still sounds like she did when she was in her 20s and she's like 60-something.
Yeah. Just raw talent,
vocal cords made of gold, Chris.
There it is. And if you don't recognize this album or this song, it's the first single by The Pretenders. And it's called The Weight. And the name of the album is Pretenders. and that's the beautiful voice of Chrissie Hynde, one of my favorite artists of all time, and one of my favorite albums of all time, one of the best debut albums in the history of the rock genre, and a punk classic.
I would agree with that too. That is pretty true, man.
Man, the Pretenders. So, I mean, as great as Remain in Light is, and Remain in Light like goes really out there and really is sonically interesting and mixes Afrobeat and all that stuff, and this is not quite as, by any stretch, what album is as adventurous as that album. Yeah. But it is so good. Like, it is such a great hallmark of everything that's incredible about Chrissie Hynde and James Honeyman Scott's guitar playing and everything like that, and it's a great evolution of punk in a kind of pop way and everything like that, and it's just one of my favorite records of all time, man. So,
agreed.
Super excited to talk about it.
I can't say I agree because I'll be completely honest and admit that I had very little knowledge of the Pretenders before Kris wanted to do this album. I knew about Chrissie Hynde. I knew that she was from Northern Ohio, and I knew that that's where the Pretenders kind of came from. I also know that she left Northern Ohio to live in London, and then that's kind of where she where everything cooked and fully baked up, and then the Pretenders kind of went full critical mass. But listening to this album, it's just such a pure rock sound.
Yeah.
It's like rock music without any bells and whistles, straightforward. The production is really solid, Yeah.
It's our man Chris Thomas behind the boards on that. Mm-hmm. Chris Thomas, who worked with the Sex Pistols, and he's worked with lots of big acts. Yeah, he's one of the great producers of the 70s and 80s, but you can kind of hear his fingerprints all over it because it's a well-produced record for sure. But
yeah, definitely. It's kind of like that Block Party record, Silent Alarm, that I really like a lot. It had that, there's the similarity between those two albums, between that one and this Pretenders record. It's like, it has this really polished and kind of nuanced production value, but it still sounds raw.
Yeah.
Like, anytime you can get that kind of polished sound, but yet have it still mean something, have something cut through, you know what I'm saying? That's really hard to do. Almost impossible, but they really pull it off here. So
yeah, I mean, it's kind of thunderous and everything like that, but it never quite, even though, you'll hear chorus on a guitar here or there or that kind of thing, it never quite turns into like that 80s thin crap sound that you sometimes hear when they try to do that, or it never quite goes the other way where it just sounds like here's butt rocking with Chrissie Hynde. I mean, it never kind of turns into that either,
Right, here's butt rock with Chrissie Hynde.
Yeah.
Well, that wouldn't even in any incarnation you can think of, it would never be butt rock because But
no, she's a rock and roll animal for sure. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that, because we did kind of joke around about how I'm bringing the Ohio heat this week.
Yeah, totally.
Which is kind of different because we've talked about a lot of Ohio bands. We talked about Ohio quite a lot. Obviously, that's where you're from and everything.
Yeah,
we talked about Guided by Voices, and we talked about the Breeders and stuff.
Absolutely.
And Chrissie is, you told me, you kind of turned me on to this thing that I wasn't aware of, that there's kind of a rivalry between like Northern Ohio and Southern Ohio and some of this. Talk to me a little bit about that, because I'm curious.
An Ohioan, someone that's from Ohio, they will have a rivalry with a stick. They'll find something wrong with anything, a pebble in front of them. It doesn't matter. So, yes, Northern Ohio and Southern Ohio do have a bit of a rivalry. Like my best friend Graham, his wife Michelle is from Northern Ohio, and she once said, yeah, anything south of Columbus is just Kentucky. We don't even consider that Ohio, So, right. And then, Cincinnati and Cleveland have a big rivalry. And something I said to Kris when we were talking last night is when people from Ohio, people that are not from Ohio, when they think of Ohio, they think of Cleveland. Cleveland has this big rock music mystique and working class mystique, and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is there, and that kind of thing. And Cleveland does have this kind of entertainment pedigree, so to speak. But
it also is like at least at one time a national joke because of the thing, the lake setting on fire and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Lake Erie caught on fire and stuff, and But at the end of the day, it's just another Rust Belt town, and Cincinnati is much the same. Cincinnati and Cleveland have more in common than they don't. They're both big Midwestern cities on a big river, or lake or whatever. Cincinnati being on the Ohio River. Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland are kind of almost interchangeable. And then like West Virginia is kind of like those cities in that state are smaller versions of those three cities, basically. Like Huntington, Charleston, and Morgantown are basically three smaller versions of
like
Pittsburgh.
Cleveland.
Yeah, pretty much. But I don't know why I brought up West Virginia.
But it's that whole area. I get it.
Yeah, yeah. In any event, yes, there's kind of a rivalry between Northern and Southern Ohio. And honestly, like I could live in Cleveland and not be pissed about it. Cleveland's not a bad place. And you said you've been to Cleveland, Chris, right?
Yeah, I went to Cleveland in 99. So I was still kind of, I was like 20-something or 20, 21. Okay. And I went up to visit a friend of mine in Indiana, went and saw Pearl Jam when they came to Indy that year. And maybe it was
cool.
98.
Where in Indiana were you?
Dalhart? I'm trying to remember. Is that the name?
Elkhart,
Indiana.
Yeah,
Elkhart.
Yeah.
So we had to drive down to go to Indy to see the show, and we were just hanging out and stuff. And then, but then while I was there, I was like, let's go to Cleveland. Like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's there. Yeah. That's I'm a music history nerd even back then, so I was like, let's go check it out. And it was really cool. I saw
it's
like Devo's
cool.
gear and like Talking Heads guitars and stuff. And like there was a lot of I think I saw the suit from Stop Making Sense. I was like, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Like
there's some cool stuff there for sure.
Trabant cars from the Zoo TV tour and stuff. So there was a lot of cool stuff there, like some Prince stuff But I went to Cleveland and I actually liked it because my attitude about Cleveland was just, back in the 80s, like Cleveland was a go-to joke as like a place you don't want to be. And I promise we're going to talk about that because Precious almost talks about this explicitly, the lead song on this album. But Cleveland was like this place you don't want to be. And then I got there, and it just seemed like a cool little town to me. Like there was an Indians game going on, and all these people were like walking down the street in their Indians gear, ready to go see the team play.
Jacobs Field, that's where they play,
which is right downtown. And so I remember thinking
absolutely.
this place feels like alive. It sounds like it feels like it would be fun to live in Cleveland,
Yeah,
and
totally.
that's something you never thought you would say,
Right.
But so now Chrissie is from Akron, right, which is a little farther north. Is it?
Yes, it is. It's it's where Goodyear Tire. Well, a bunch of Firestone and Goodyear Tire were based there at one time. I think Firestone still might be, but I could be wrong about that. Some Northern Ohio people may need to correct me. But Akron was the rubber capital of the world for years. During the industrial heyday of the U.S., before all of those jobs got outsourced to other countries for cheaper labor, Akron was to car tires what Detroit was to actual cars. That's where all the tires were made. So,
wow. See, I didn't realize that.
Absolutely.
But that kind of sounds like Chrissie's background. Like she grows up in the rubber tire capital of the United States.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The impression that I get is that she was pretty anonymous back then. Like she didn't feel like she didn't fit in. She didn't fit into the Northern Ohio thing. She didn't really so at some point she just up and leaves. And she just goes to London with no friends, no one. She doesn't know anybody. She just is such a rock and roll chick that she's just like, I'm out of here. Let's go figure it out.
Totally. Well, I was watching an interview with her today on YouTube, and she talked about that. And she said, all I wanted to do when I was living in Akron was move out of my parents' house. And she was like, everything in my town was closing up. Akron, there wasn't anything going on. Like the downtown, there was nothing happening there. So she was like, where was I going to move to? I wasn't going to move downtown. What am I going to do? Play music for 2 people? No. So, I got to go somewhere cool. I got to go somewhere that things are actually happening. And that's a big reason why she went to, it's kind of funny. Like, well, I'm not going to go to Akron. So maybe I'll go to like Chicago or Detroit or, I'm going to go to London.
Yeah.
I'm going to go halfway across the fucking planet. And not just like another bigger city 200 miles away. Right. I kind of like only someone like Chrissie Hynde could do that.
Like the level of respect, the guts really just to kind of say, to hell with it. Dude. I'm going to go to London. I'm going to go to London because that's where they're making the music I love, you know?
Right.
Like that's, I mean, I didn't do that, you know, like I wasn't that brave, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, are you kidding me? When I was her age at that time, like all of my favorite music was coming out of the UK.
Yeah, that's
but
true.
I didn't pack up.
But you didn't say, I'm going to go to London and be in the next Blur.
Yeah, I wasn't like, I'm going to go to London and meet Damon Albarn. And see
like, I'm going to go hang with the Stone
album.
Roses. I don't
yeah, exactly. Like that. I mean, but that's kind of what she did, you know?
Yeah,
she was just kind of like, hell, let's go.
And then back then, you could almost do that. That's what's so mind-blowing about this time period in music, man. Like, you know, it's nutty. I didn't mean to cut you off there, but but kind of there's an accessibility thing that I think is something we may need to, that we've kind of already brought up. But,
well, I mean, think about it. What does she do? So she goes to the UK, mid-70s. She works in Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood's.
Their clothing store.
Their clothing store. So she's working literally with like the woman who helped design punk as a fashion movement. You know, like she's literally working for. So talk about leaving Akron to bigger things. You know, like
so I think it was Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols. He said it. I heard him say in an interview that if you went into that store, they were always there was no one ever actually working there. It was just Malcolm and Vivienne Westwood were there, and they were in the back doing heroin the whole time.
That's probably true.
Jesus, man.
Yeah.
But anyway.
I mean, so maybe it wasn't so glamorous after all, but you know, but still, I mean, like she's meeting people who were like going to have a huge influence on culture pretty quickly.
Totally.
And then she like played an early version of The Clash, apparently. Like,
I saw that. I couldn't believe that. That's nuts.
Like she was just kind of going around trying to get into bands, and the sense that I get is that that's all she ever really wanted out of life was to play in a band. You know, like to play guitar and sing in a band. Yeah. And the thing is that she's got an incredible voice too. Yeah, I read some review of. It was like some later review of like the early Pretender stuff, and they were saying the crazy thing about Chrissie Hynde is that she didn't have to be a great songwriter. Like she could have just been like Debbie Harry or something, like a great singer that fronted a band with, you know, and hire somebody to write the damn songs. But she didn't. She turned into like almost like a female Elvis Costello or a female. Somewhere between Elvis Costello and Tom Petty, I think. She's got a little bit more straightforward vibe that's a little bit more Tom Petty than Elvis Costello, but she's capable of kind of stretching out a little bit more than Petty does, I think. No offense to Petty.
I would agree with that. Petty kind of has a more folk kind of influence, I think, and Chrissie Hynde is very much more rock influenced. Right. So,
and she's similar to Elvis Costello in the sense that like they have a punk root for sure. Yeah. But they were never going to just be a punk band forever. You know, in a punk band. They were always going to be kind of somewhere between punk and rock. And and I think like if you're not familiar with the Pretenders, go in with kind of that expectation that you're not quite listening to a raw punk band all the way, but a band that kind of straddles the line between like a badass garage rock band and a punk band. You know.
Yeah.
And but I guess my point is that she could have just done it with her voice. But instead, she develops a great writing voice. And one of the things that's super impressive about this album is the writing itself, because it is, and we haven't had a chance to talk a lot about female artists on this. And I think it's just been a fluke, you know, like we've talked about it before, where it's like, I think we just happened to pick years where, you know, Stevie Wonder came up or something like that. But but there are a lot of great female artists from this time period, but I really think the 80s are, and it's because of people like Chrissie and Debbie and the Go-Go's and stuff, like it's kind of the first decade where being a woman in a rock band can no longer be treated like a novelty.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you have Joan Jett, you have the Go-Go's, you have, you know, Debbie Harry. You know, that's real shit. You know what I'm saying? That's to be, you know, you take those acts seriously for sure, and Chrissie was no exception.
Right. Well, Chrissie has said that that's what she loved about punk. You know, that punk was basically said that, you know, just go be yourself and go do what you want to do. Kind of we were just talking about it, but she said that was what she was always grateful for, because they didn't laugh at her for wanting to be a rock, you know, a rock artist, a guitarist, you know, like it was welcoming.
Right.
And what a gift to the world, you know.
Oh, my God. And, you know, and these songs on this album, you know, and I kind of talked about this when we had our phone conversation last night. You know, she has this incredible voice, and I don't mean this as a slight when I say this, but, like, she doesn't really use it. She uses it when she needs to, and a lot of the lyrics are kind of this like talky stream of consciousness kind of thing, and she's still singing and she still sounds great, but like she really uses her voice at the right times, and the other times she's not using it, it's just kind of setting a mood or setting a vibe, I feel like. Does that make sense?
No, I do. She's got a great alto voice. You know what?
Yeah.
She's not always running out there trying to wail and hit these high notes and be impressive in that way, you know, which a lot of female singers are tempted to do or kind of pressured to do, I think.
Exactly. Yeah,
whereas
totally.
a lot of times, like you said, she
see.
even seems like she's almost talk singing in parts, you know what I mean? And not really... But it's always super fluid and like just it's the best sound. You know, she's just she may be my favorite female rock singer ever. Like I think she may be. Let's talk a little bit about the songwriting point of view though, and I want to play Up the Neck, which is probably my favorite song on this record. So let me play a little bit of Up the Neck.
Yeah,
I love the way this song is produced too. You can hear that. Now, James Honeyman Scott, we've got to talk about because the band is not just Chrissie Hynde, but we'll get to that.
James Honeyman Scott in his nudie suit, nudie style jacket. I should read that at some point if you don't mind.
That Kurt Loder?
Yeah.
You can hear that Chris Thomas production here. You know, it's like really nice and clean.
Right.
Listen to how she's singing here. That's an alto voice, you know, she's not singing really high up in her range, but listen to how like velvety that is.
Yeah. And that's another thing too that kind of goes back to the point of, well, you know, it has this really highfalutin production value. It sounds really clean. Her voice sounds really clean, but yet you have this rawness that kind of cuts and strikes through all of that. You know, so.
And then she's singing from a female perspective. That's the other thing I love about it is that and I love Joan Jett, and you probably can find Joan Jett tracks that are, you know, like Cherry Bomb or something that's kind of from a female perspective. But to some degree, they sound like songs that Kim Fowley like wrote for her or something. Like I Love Rock and Roll isn't particularly a woman's point of view or whatever.
Right.
Whereas, and no offense to Joan Jett, she's got a lot of great stuff. But like I think Chrissie is one of the first women artists who really sang from a woman's perspective and not like she's saying from like a feminist perspective, you know. She's
totally
frankly about sexual politics, sex. You know, like this song Up the Neck has one of my favorite lyrics ever where she talks about her lover getting angry, and she said, and the veins bulged on his brow, like she sort of holds it for a second, you know. But I mean, it doesn't even feel like just a joke or a double entendre. It's like it's a woman's kind of point of view of a bad lover, kind of, you know. And there's like there's a power relationship thing going on in this song, and it's real. It's kind of punk and gross in a way, but it's also unique and beautiful, and you know, it's almost like a short story. So, and I think that, I guess going back to the point that I wanted to underline here is that Chrissie didn't have to go that hard. You know, she could have just sang whatever, you know, Heart of Glass or something, you know.
Exactly.
And she didn't. She decided instead to write from her own perspective, which is a badass rock chick's perspective. Yeah. And in that sense, she's a little bit more. Patti Smith is another one we haven't mentioned yet, but she's a little bit more from like the Patti Smith school of like. Of sort of feminist poetry put to music.
I almost feel like she's like the middle ground between Patti Smith is on one side of the spectrum and Debbie Harry is on the other. She's like right in the middle.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And I love all three of those artists.
Oh, me too, absolutely.
Like, so don't get it twisted, guys. We're not knocking any of that. But I agree. I think what's great is that it shows that you can find a middle ground there without it being a compromise. Right. You know what I mean? Right. Like she ends up being her own thing, and it doesn't feel like, oh, she's sort of squishy in the middle. And I mean, it's the other thing about the Pretenders is I think like they're super marketable. Like I don't think that a lot of people would listen to this, and it's not inaccessible in any way, you know? Like I have a friend who's like a very, very kind of uptight Christian person, you know, like and she was like talking about, oh, one of my best memories is listening to Tattooed Love Boys with a friend of mine and blah blah. And I was like, whoa, that song's a little intense.
That's a very intense, risque track, man. That's nuts.
Exactly. But it's just the music is so, catchy and accessible that they stop and think, okay, well, what are we talking about here? But a lot of times she's talking about, sexual politics and like a very strong feminine position on it, almost like a proto Liz Phair or something.
Yeah,
and I think that's one of the hallmarks of the record too.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to talk about the opening track, "Precious," though, because we were just talking about her feelings of leaving Ohio, and "Precious" has one of my favorite lines, and I always just loved the line anyway, just because it's funny. But then this week, I figured out what she was talking about. Let me get to the line about Howard the Duck in "Precious."
Oh yeah.
So this is a song about leaving. This is a song about leaving Ohio, pretty much.
Yeah.
But she's got this line.
Now Howard the Duck and Mr. Stress both stayed.
Now Howard the Duck and Mr. Stress both stayed.
Yeah. Trapped in a world they never made.
But not me, baby. I'm too precious. I had to fuck off.
Not me, baby. I'm too precious. I had to fuck off.
Yeah.
Yeah. So apparently Howard the Duck is based in Cleveland. So those of you who know Howard the Duck only from the terrible movie, I mean, it is a great underground '70s comic, back in the day. Yeah. But
isn't
Mr. Stress?
Isn't Howard the movie Howard the Duck, the principal from Ferris Bueller's Day Off was in that movie?
Was he?
He was the
I
bad
think that
guy.
guy's turned out to be a total creep or something.
He
right?
did, yeah. Oh, he's an absolute creep. He's in jail as we speak. Which I guess I probably shouldn't have brought him up, but
to hell with that guy. But that movie is so awful. But anyway, I love that she's basically the opening track of her first album is kind of this tongue-in-cheek thing about leaving Ohio. Yeah. And Ohio does kind of haunt the record. She brings it up a couple of other times. And if you're familiar with her other albums, she has a song called "My City Was Gone" and stuff. Definitely Ohio is not something that she completely left behind her. It is something that continued to be a part of her identity and stuff as she went on. But
Ohio, kind of a haunting place back then. I mean, that's when the bottom started to drop out and the whole complete Rust Belt. And I mean, now those towns have been kind of repurposed and, that kind of thing. And the people that live there are all working like tech jobs and shit like that. And there's not a ton of industry there anymore. But back then, it was rough. I mean, like the downtown in your city is just completely desolate and drab, and there's absolutely nothing going on. It's crazy, man. Like all the buildings are derelict around you.
That like Devo came out of a similar. I mean, they came out of Dayton, right?
Yeah, for sure. No, Devo is from Cleveland.
From Cleveland, okay.
Devo is Northern Ohio too. Yeah, for sure.
So they had kind of a similar thing where it's like that. I don't know. It makes sense that a group like Devo would come from a place that's kind of hollowed out like that.
Actually, Devo
is from
Akron as well. Well, Kent, Ohio. Kent and Akron, Ohio. Kent, where Kent State University is.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah. So anyway.
A lot of cool stuff coming from that period. But going back to the album for a second, a couple of other tracks on it. I'm curious, since you weren't super familiar with the Pretenders, were there some tracks that hopped out to you as some of your favorites?
Yeah, Up the Neck, I really like.
For sure. Yeah.
Space Invaders fun. It's like instrumental,
it is.
Right? Yeah.
I like that crazy. It ends with a straight up like the Space Invaders sound.
Yeah, absolutely.
Aliens speeding up at the end of Space Invaders or whatever.
Yeah, and so Stop Your Sobbing, the last track on side A. It's Ray Davies wrote that song?
Yeah. That's a Kinks song, yeah.
That's nuts. That's
crazy. And I love the original Kinks version. In fact, I heard the Kinks version first. Okay. But I think this is a better version, actually. Yeah. Like, it's one of those rare times, and I love the Kinks. It's not a knock on them, but I think you can't beat that voice. It was their first single from the album. I think The Wait may have had a shorter, there was an earlier version of The Wait, but that was released as like a 7-inch. So for a lot of people, Stop Your Sobbing was the beginning of, like the first thing they heard from the Pretenders. Listen to how she does it, and it really is super true to the original version.
Yeah, okay. I've not heard the original version. I've heard the one on this album, obviously. Never listened.
You can hear just by the chiming guitars and stuff that, I mean, it's straight up British Invasion. I mean, it is the Kinks, really.
Right.
She was so true to the original version with the Kinks that she ended up having a baby with Ray Davies.
Seriously?
Seriously, yeah.
What? her and Ray Davies have a kid together?
Yeah, they sure do. Yeah.
That's wild.
They were together for a long time, and it was all acrimonious and shit. But yeah, it was some kind of crazy relationship they had. But yeah, so she was a huge fan of the Kinks, and you can kind of hear that in the sounds of the guitars on here.
Yeah.
What do you think of you probably knew Brass in Pocket already, right?
A little bit, yeah. I had heard that song before. I think maybe once or twice before, for sure.
Yeah, that had a very famous video on MTV.
Yeah.
I won't play it. A lot of people know that one, but it's a fantastic track. Kid is one of my favorites.
Yeah.
It's such a great a pop punk kind of song or whatever, kind of straightforward, and her singing so good on it. So, in Mystery Achievement, I mean, honestly, every track on this is something is worthwhile.
It's pretty. It's packed. It's bangers left and right, man. Like it's one of those full albums. Like you listen to it all the way through. Like you don't skip around or anything, for sure.
And I think it still holds up. I think people who especially if you liked music in the indie music in the 2000s or something, and you like the Strokes and shit.
Oh my God!
I think if you go back and listen to Pretenders, you're going to be like, oh yeah, I totally get where all that music kind of came from. You like the New Pornographers or something. Like go back and listen to Kid. You're going to hear some stuff that's familiar.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I never thought about comparing those two, but they do kind of work together. I feel like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a couple more things about the Pretenders before we wrap up. So the Pretenders were kind of cursed band in a way. Yeah. The first two albums, really the first three albums are classic albums, and I think you can listen to those three albums. And not everything. I think this is the best of the three as far as bangers from start to finish.
Sure.
There's a couple of misses on the other two, but there's more hits than misses on the others, and I would say all three of them are classics. So Pretenders 2, and Learning to Crawl. Now, after the second Pretenders album, Pete Farndon, the bass player, died of I think a drug overdose, and then James Honeyman Scott, the incredible guitar player throughout here, also died of a drug overdose. So you have a 4-person band, Chrissie, those two, and Martin Chambers, great drummer on this, a killer drummer, actually, I would say. And between the second and third record, they lost half the band to drugs.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it's awful. And the question then becomes, what happens to the Pretenders after that? And what it becomes is, the Chrissie realizes she feels an obligation to James Honeyman Scott in particular. Jimmy Scott, right? She says she felt an obligation to keep the band going for his memory.
Right.
And it sort of becomes the strength of the band and to the longevity of the band, but also kind of the weakness of the band is that you can't really replace that guy. He's such a slippery guitar player and such an interesting guitar player. Johnny Marr has cited him as a major influence. And
I can see that. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And if you listen to I'm really into Britpop from the 90s, and you listen to guitar players like John Squire from the Stone Roses or Graham Coxon from Blur. They're completely indebted to James Honeyman Scott, maybe through Johnny Marr, but what James Honeyman Scott was doing as a guitar player is not that far off of what Graham Coxon was doing on There's No Other Way or something like that, or what the Stone Roses were doing on a song like Elephant Stone. So I think without him and without the Pretenders, you kind of don't have that whole movement. But then with his death, the Pretenders have this hole that's just unfillable, and they fill it with session cats, and so. And some of them are good, like Robbie McIntosh is in the band for a while, and he's really good, and he plays on Learning to Crawl, and that's a good record. But after a while, when they're at Get Close and songs like Don't Get Me Wrong, which is a really good song, but you can kind of tell that there are session cats playing with them at that point, that it's not, and it's sort of, while Chrissie's influence is still there and her songs are still there and they're still unbreakable, in some ways, it's a band of lost potential because of the deaths of those members, because I don't think there's anyone who would debate what would Pact have sounded like, what would Last of the Independents have sounded like with those two guys still playing in the band. Probably incredible, but they still are worthwhile, and the Pretenders are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and were inducted pretty early, and they end up being this band that has a massive critical respect and hit songs that people know, but they aren't household names.
Right. That is kind of strange. Yeah.
Yeah, for a band that's as big or has had as much of an influence as they've had, and who was really there and has created quality work. And sometimes I just think it goes back to the fact that with the loss of those two guys, like whatever momentum they had as a band, as a unit, kind of got lost in there somewhere.
Right.
And I think that's too bad because there's a lot of good stuff after this,
Yeah.
I saw the Pretenders in 2006.
Oh, really?
Yeah, at the Austin Music Hall. Amazing gig. Her voice was so good. It was the Adam Seymour era. He's a great guitarist and everything.
Yeah.
They did a killer version of My City Was Gone.
Yeah.
And like literally she just like looked over at Adam and was like, just keep going. And she like let him just rip a solo for an extra minute or something.
That's
and
awesome.
It was great,
Yeah.
And she's so charismatic and fun and everything. And right now, of course, we're all locked down, so there's no chance to see them.
Unfortunately,
they were booked to open for Journey.
What?
Like this summer they were going to open for Journey. I was the only way you're going to drag me to a Journey concert. I was like, well, maybe I'll go to
the Journey
Chrissie.
with the cover band lead singer, like that version of Journey.
Yeah, I guess so. It's weird to think. I guess I wanted to underline that here's a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame band, one of the most influential, one of the greatest female artists of all time, opening for Journey. The hell is going on there, Marty? Why?
I don't fucking know.
Yeah, I don't. What the fuck? It doesn't make sense to me. But it's.
Well, the only thing I can think of is maybe Journey is playing bigger venues than the Pretenders would play if they were to just book a regular tour. But still, I mean, I don't know. The Pretenders could play like ACL Live, I feel like, and they could pack that place easily.
Yeah,
I don't know. They would be on tour right now. They just came out with a new album, so they would definitely be on tour. So,
yeah, which it's pretty good. The new album. It's
I haven't listened to it.
Yeah, it's good. It's kind of what you expect, and that's kind of the downside of the Pretenders after a point.
Right.
But they've got. The thing is that I don't think I've heard much out of Chrissie that wasn't at least good.
Yeah.
There may be stuff where you're like,
Yeah.
Isle of You may have some tracks on it where you're like, well, whatever. Yeah. But like
I can take or leave this. It's not terrible though, kind of thing.
Yeah, there's not really much where it's just like, oh, that's just embarrassing. Like she doesn't do that kind of stuff. But I think the downside is that sometimes she doesn't stretch out and do stuff you wouldn't expect.
Yeah.
And that becomes, it's more like the Rolling Stones. She's like 65 years old. She's been at it for a long time at this point.
A while. Yeah.
And she doesn't owe anybody anything. And that's what's kind of awesome about her is that she's all rock and roll. She just says what she wants. She's like PETA, throws blood on a KFC and stuff.
Right.
Puts her foot in her mouth all the time and stuff. Yeah. But in a way that I think is really she's earned the right to be over the top and do what she, because and she's such a great interview subject. I was going to read some quotes from her, in fact, let's see if I still got some pulled up here because she's really funny. I love this. The one thing I hated about drugs was the assholes you had to hang out with to get them. That's like such a Chrissie Hynde kind of quote or whatever.
Totally. Yeah.
She's like, the so-called feminist writers were disgusted with me. I did my thing, so I guess by feminist standards, I'm a feminist, and that suits me just fine.
Yeah. Unapologetic. What? Yeah, okay. I'm just a person. You want to call me a feminist? Cool. I don't know. So, I'm with that. I'm down with that.
Yeah, she's got a lot of. She has one quote that's really funny.
Those are from her book, right? Those quotes.
Yeah, there's some quotes from her book. Yeah, but she's great in interviews too. I have a guitar magazine somewhere. I was trying to dig it up and I couldn't find it, but where it's just she's just dropping these hilarious. She's almost like Morrissey in that way.
Yeah,
but not just the strident vegetarianism. Yeah, Morrissey's awful. Well,
Morrissey has his own issues. But,
but I mean, Morrissey is really funny. Like when he's back in the day, if you read the old Morrissey interviews, he could be very funny or catty or something, and it'd just be entertaining. But she's got one quote where she's like, the way I look at it, and this is like devastating quote actually. She's like, now I'm making $10,000 for every terrible act of sodomy I was forced to perform to get into the music industry.
Ugh.
And it's like, she says that and it's just like, oh shit. You know? And she's talked about how the music industry hasn't had its Me Too moment yet.
Yeah,
and she said, but it's coming.
It's good. Yeah, for sure.
And I don't know if she's just being punk when she says that particular quote, but the fact that she said it, it's like it also shows how she she had a different experienced than your average person. You know,
yeah, totally.
And she had to, you know. And I just admire that about her because, again, she's just a take no crap kind of person, you know.
Agree.
And she shouldn't, to be honest with you. She doesn't owe anybody anything, you know.
Exactly.
So, so guys, go check it out. The first Pretenders album is just called The Pretenders, so it's easy enough to find, self-titled record. Bangers from start to finish. And then after that, check out Pretenders 2. There's a lot of really good stuff on that, and Learning to Crawl as well. Like I said, they're a little less consistent, but it's got middle of the road, day after day. There's like some really great guitar playing on those other records. Message of Love, everybody knows that track. That's so good.
When did Pete and James die? What album did they make when they were both gone? Was Pretenders 2 with them or no?
They made Pretenders 2, so they made the first two.
Okay.
Yeah, and then Learning to Crawl is the third one, and that's got Robbie McIntyre. That's when the session cats kind of come in. But that album is still really, really good. Like it's, and again, Chrissie kind of holds it all together. When they were inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Chrissie said, "I know the Pretenders have sounded like a tribute band for the last 20 years." Like she said, "I know that about this band," and I think she was kind of owning up to the fact that like the moment James is gone, it's like they have to, everybody who plays with them kind of does a James Honeyman Scott thing. Right, and that's not the same as having him there. Yeah. And she knows it, you know, but then what can you do? You don't have a choice.
Yeah, he's not there.
Dead.
Like,
exactly. So it's one of those things where it's like the writing is still there. And it's just, it's not a frustrating listen because those albums are still good. Sure. But the later albums, you think about what could have been if that hadn't happened. So what we're trying to say, guys, is don't use drugs.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is all really an intervention.
Don't do cocaine. Like, you know, I've always been scared to do cocaine because I always thought just my heart was going to fucking explode. Like, and I'm really glad I had that fear, you know. I mean,
among other things, I just is too damn cheap for anything like that. Yeah. I mean, what? No, I don't need another thing to waste my money on. I'm already buying records.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
I don't need any
that's
kind
my
of
cocaine.
New addiction. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
so. Well, fantastic. Man. Well, I'm glad that you got a chance to be introduced to it, man.
Yeah. So what I wanted to say, the thing I wanted to table, and I'm going to get this wrong because I remember watching it from an interview or something, and you might know something about this, but Chrissie said something about the reason why there were a lot of British bands on MTV when it first started is because somehow British bands already had like videos of them playing live and stuff. And I don't remember for what reason she said they had that in place already, but she was like, you know, the reason why we were all over MTV in the early days and all the British bands were is because we had, you know, video footage of us playing live and, you know.
Yeah, that's true.
That was, you know, that they were videos. Like it was content MTV could show at the time when they were really starved for content. This new network starting out just showing music videos. So I thought that was interesting. You know,
yeah, Brass in Pocket has a very famous video that was played on MTV a lot. When MTV actually launched, that was, you know, it's got that great moment where like James Honeyman Scott and they're saying the word, I'm special, and they're like in a diner and they're pointing to like the special on the menu. So it's it's, you know, and it's really like this funny kind of thing. But so the thing with MTV in the early days, and the thing with music videos is that, you know, if you're a European band in 1979, 1980 or something like that, you've got a lot of markets in their individual markets to go to, and it's hard to book a tour. It's a lot harder to book a tour of Europe than it is to just get in your station wagon and drive to Indiana or something and go, right? So one of the ways they had been trying to get the name out was through alternative ways, which is the music video. So if you look at like a video Killed the Radio Star by the Buggles, right? Like this is famously the first video ever played on MTV. Yeah. Right, but that song came out in 1979. Like that song came out 4 years before MTV or something, you know? So why would they have a video at all? Well, because they were a British band and they were probably trying to break into France or something or Germany. And so it was a lot easier to send a music video out ahead of them, you know, and try to get that played on German TV or something than it was to go out and, you know, just play the Reeperbahn or something with a bunch of people who don't speak your language and probably screw you over, you know. Yeah. So when MTV opened up, there were two things that worked there. Listen to me, now it's suddenly in history of MTV, but there are two things there. There was, you know, the British bands had the videos, but then the American acts didn't want to make them. They were like, to hell with videos. Like, I don't need that. I'm already selling out the arena, and I'm in Foreigner, or whatever. Like those guys. They already had
freaking Foreigner, man.
Yeah, like why do I need MTV? I'm and a lot of them, of course, and there's some truth to this. They're just not photogenic people. They didn't really. They're like, look, I'm not an actor. I'm in this because I want to.
Yeah, a 12-year-old is not going to put a poster of them up in their room. Well, maybe not yet, but
right. And so they were realistic about it. Like if you're Geddy Lee, you're not American, but if you're Geddy Lee, you're like, I'm not going to be a pinup star next to Sting. Yeah, like to hell, why are we going to make a music video? It doesn't make sense, Right. And but then of course MTV blew up so big that those bands suddenly had to be on MTV. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So I want to leave you guys with this. And I did a quick vocal test last night on my mic here, and I read an excerpt from an article that was written by the great Kurt Loder. He wrote it in Rolling Stone back in 1980, and it was kind of like an interview with Chrissie Hynde while they were on tour, touring on this album. This is an account from one of their gigs that took place at a club called Detroit in Port Chester, New York. Not in the city of Detroit, Michigan, but a club called the Detroit.
What is that with New York? Max's, Kansas City,
yeah, I know.
Detroit. Like, what are we doing?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what
the rest of us are just there. We're like the dollhouse for New York City.
Exactly, yeah. So this is kind of an account from Kurt Loder right before they took the stage and as they took the stage. This is what he had to say. So I'm going to read this as closely as I can, just as best as I did like last night. Yeah. So out front in Detroit's main room, the last pummeling power chords of the Ramones' I Want to Be Sedated have receded into the house speakers. Suddenly, the air shivers with the bombastic strains of Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, which Dave Hill has nicked off the Apocalypse Now soundtrack for use as a fanfare. The Pretenders scurry on stage, the now accounted for Honeyman Scott looking aroused and resplendent in a sparkling white nudie-style cowboy jacket. Hynde, primed and nearly bouncing, jacks in her white Telecaster, and before the capacity crowd even has time to cheer, she shouted out the raggedy count for the wait. Amazing, right? For the next hour, the Pretenders' music, much of it composed in treacherously eccentric meters, explodes off the stage. Chambers churns up a brutal Bo Diddley beat for the jaunty Cuban Slide, the B-side of their latest British single Talk of the Town, and then downshifts into a walloping primordial thud for Stop Your Sobbing. Farndon's fat, fluid bass slides through the tricky rhythms like an oiled snake, coiling up in unexpected grace notes and quirky arpeggios, then slipping back into the dense sonic mix to await another opening. The radiant Kid stirs some of the crowd to sing along, and Chrissy's full, uncaged alto soars. So I think that's like, that just really puts you there. Like, if I could write anything that good, I would be amazed with myself.
Like guys our age think of Kurt Loder and we think of MTV News.
Yeah, we think of the dopey guy that was on MTV News, but look at this shit. Read this, man.
You know what I love about that, really, is it underlines he's a great writer, but it's not too much. I mean,
not flashy. Yeah,
it's like you're talking about the radiant Kid. Yeah. Like, that's the right way to talk about it.
Just the right amount of floral language.
We get that purple prose of Robert Christgau. You read all that stuff for a while, and you start to think, God, these guys were so up their own. But,
oh my God, yeah.
But Loder could do it. Like he could make you want to be there without it sounding like he's just I don't know, exercising his masters of English literature or something.
No, you're right. You're totally
writing about pop bands or something.
Yeah. So I thought I'd leave you guys with that nice little excerpt. And
I've got one more great Chrissie Hynde quote here, just apropos of nothing. If you don't have a flag sticking out of your ass, you must be a communist. That is so.
Oh my God!
I think she was talking about that late or that early 2000s post 9/11 moment or whatever. But if you don't have a flag sticking out of your ass, you must be a communist.
Yeah,
this is so great.
Yeah. That's great, man.
Yeah, dude. No, going back to your Loder quote. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Yeah, dude. Like that feels like what a gift to the world the Pretenders were. What a great band. I wish I could have seen the band when those guys were still alive. But
it would have been incredible, right?
The way he describes them sounds completely what I would expect that show to have been like.
Yeah.
So,
agreed.
So just beautiful. So everybody, I can't recommend it enough. Check out
Yeah.
that first Pretenders record. Check
Yeah.
out some of the others. And then if all this opens up again, man, I don't know. Put up with Journey. Go see them on tour. You know, Chrissy still got it. She's still got the
I
great
would
voice.
go if that tour comes to Austin. I'll go with you just to see the Pretenders. Like,
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
You know, we can hang around and heckle Journey at the end of it. But there's someone
maybe
out there
it'll
who's
be
like,
at the
but I
Cedar
like
Park
Journey,
Center,
Chris."
like the P-Funk show.
Yeah.
Maybe I can get accosted in the bathroom by a Journey fan.
Say Journey has several good
Yeah.
albums.
You don't like any way you want it. What the fuck is wrong with you, man? Oh, jeez.
I love that.
All right,
Well,
man. Well,
don't
I
stop
think,
believing, Marty.
Well, awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. This is a fun talk. I'm really excited
Yeah.
to see how it comes out. So.
And I'm super excited to talk about the next album too. And we're going to
Me
get into the
too.
charts next time. So
Oh,
remember, guys,
yeah.
in 1980 will be a fun one, man.
Yeah.
We'll get a chance. And there's something really sad that happened in 1980, but we're not going to talk about it now. We'll talk about it next time. So,
Sounds good.
so until then, so that's not the note to end this on, guys. It's incredible to be back. We're back in action. Can't wait to listen to more records.
Can't wait to
and
share
talk about 'em.
this stuff with you. It's going to
Yeah.
be great, and really hope you dig it.
Yeah. So you guys have a great one, and
Yeah.
we'll see you on the flip.
Let's catch you on the flip, guys. Later.